Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 18 and 19. So let's begin. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling, Chapters 18 and 19. And as I'm sure you've all noticed, we have a transfer student. Please make him feel welcome, class, Miss Samae said, facing her class before she looked down at Izuku. Izuku, please introduce yourself, she instructed. Izuku nodded. He was eager to get back to school. After the move, summer had been boring. After their clash, Tomura had been distant. Where before, they would have had some time together, the older boy made sure he was almost never in the same area as him. It was like Tomura was living on a completely different schedule. Kurogiri had noticed but didn't comment, and his dad had just looked at them both but again said nothing. Izuku suspected he had said something to Tomura though. That meant, after the move, summer had dragged on forever. Any notion Izuku had that being somewhere new would be more exciting was quickly dashed. He'd watched TV for hero fights and had noted down each quirk, but even that got boring. He'd practiced with his dad, and while he could feel that there were more things to learn with Kaylee Imperium, he felt that he was missing a vital piece of information there. Dad had let him practice with some new quirks and even practice using his quirk. He'd been able to take 5 quirks from his dad at once, and give them back from a distance of 10 meters. His father had been pleased but had indicated that they'd need more volunteers for Izuku to practice taking quirks from multiple people and giving them back. When Izuku had asked why he was practicing this, even though people hated having their quirk taken, Dad had gotten Dr. Garaki to explain that making sure he was proficient in his quirk ensured he was stable. He wasn't entirely sure what that meant. So, summer had dragged until school was a blissful thought. Izuku gave the class a sunny smile and bowed to them. My name is Izuku Kawa, he gave his name. Dad had explained that after the raid, just to be safe, he should use another name and his papers had been altered. I like science, he added. And your quirk? Miss Samae asked. Teacher? Izuku asked. Tell everyone what your quirk is, she instructed. I don't have one, Izuku said. In order to learn about people, Dad said he had to pretend he didn't have one. He wasn't sure what he would learn, but he trusted his father. Oh! Miss Samae exclaimed. Oh, well, take your seat. Zakuro will show you around at lunch, she added. Izuku nodded and moved to the empty desk, ignoring the whispers. It was the first day of school and he could imagine that many of the friends had a lot to catch up on. If he'd been at his old school, he would have been whispering with Okeko and Minato. He got out his notebook and pencil case and then hung his bag on the hook. The class started with Miss Samae running over what the expected schedule was. Izuku paid attention to identify any differences from his old school. Thankfully there didn't appear as if there was any, and classes continued until the lunch break. Izuku looked around, trying to identify Zakuro, who Miss Samae had said would show him around. He noticed a couple of his classmates looking at him and gave them a smile and a little wave. Eventually a black-haired boy came over. Let's get this over with, he said. Hi. Izuku greeted him. The boy sighed and Izuku wondered if he'd had a restless night. Come on, newbie, he said, gesturing for Izuku to follow him. Izuku rose and he pushed his chair back under his desk before following the boy, who he presumed was Zakuro. Are you really quirkless? Zakuro asked. Yes, Izuku admitted. The boy sighed again, and threaded his way through the crowded corridors. We are in the West Wing. That's for the first 3 years. Next year, we will be moving to the North Wing for 4th and 5th year, he said in a monotone. Izuku was thankful that he hadn't made any further comment about his quirkless status. He looked around at the students. Most were dressed in the uniform, but every now and then Izuku saw a student with a mutation quirk, for whom the uniform wouldn't fit or would be uncomfortable. It was so fascinating. The quirks were different from his old elementary, and Izuku knew he'd be starting a new notebook as soon as he got home with his observations. The East Wing has the hall, the cafeteria, the labs and the 6th-year classrooms, Zakuro explained. Where are we going? Izuku asked. The cafeteria, Zakuro replied as if it should be obvious. I already have my lunch, Izuku said. I don't, Zakuro said with a groan. Look, the bathroom is that way, he said, gesturing vaguely down the hall. You'll work it out, he added, and then stalked off. Izuku blinked but had enough presence of mind to step to the side of the hallway. That wasn't how he'd thought things would go. He looked around. Zakuro had disappeared into the general mass of students. Izuku shook his head and looked up and down the corridor before he sighed and turned back to the classroom. They hadn't gone far, so he could figure out that much. He kept to the sides of the corridor and made it back to the room. Izuku let himself in and went back to his desk. His bag was still hanging there and Izuku slipped back into his seat to pull out his lunch. There were a few people eating in the room, but he thought most of them had probably gone outside. The weather was good after all. A frown appeared on his features as he rummaged in his bag. Kurogiri had put his bento in there, but he couldn't feel it. He picked his bag off the hook and put it on the desk before opening it properly. There were 2 more notebooks and a textbook. His pencils were there and no bento. Izuku felt his frown deepen. He knew it had been there. He'd seen it. There was a giggle from the door. Izuku looked up, but all he saw was the shadow of a student walk by. Shouldn't have left it, quirkless. What? Izuku asked, looking around, trying to determine who'd spoken. He didn't know the people in his class well enough to place the voice, but it gave him some idea of what had happened. Someone had taken his lunch. Izuku frowned, and packed up his bag. If they had taken his lunch, what else would they take? And then he walked back into the corridor. He had to talk with Miss Samae. It was only once he made it to the corridor that Izuku realized he didn't know where the teacher's lounge was. He thought about it for a few moments, trying to deduce where it would be. It probably wasn't in this wing, Izuku realized. If the first 3 years were taught in this wing, there would only be classrooms here. That meant it had to be in either the north or east wings. What had Zakuro said? The north wing had 4th and 5th year classrooms. And the east wing had the assembly hall, cafeteria, labs and 6th year classrooms. The teacher's lounge was probably in the north wing, he decided as he walked down the steps. Once on the ground floor, Izuku looked around. The crush of people had dissipated as everyone settled down for lunch. He made his way to what he thought was the north wing and went down the corridor, looking around curiously. It wasn't much different from the west wing. The corridors were the same and he walked down the one on the ground floor. The teacher's lounge was probably on this level, right? The problem was, he couldn't see any door or sign for it, and the few students he saw were hurrying or already talking to their friends. What have we here? Izuku spun at the voice and saw a girl, with blonde hair looking at him. Her hair was tied up in 2 very messy pigtails, that curled around themselves. Izuku was no expert but thought that the pigtails were the result of buns falling out. "I'm looking for the teacher's lounge," he told her. "Could you give me directions, please?" The girl pushed off from the wall she was leaning on and walked over to him. Izuku stood still as she walked around him once, looking at him from every direction. "Well, you aren't a first year," she said. "I'm a transfer student," Izuku explained. That's why he didn't know where it was. "What cha gonna give me for showing you?" she asked. Izuku blinked. Why would he need to give her anything? "I know. You can buy me lunch," she announced. "I don't have any money," Izuku told her. "Then you can share your lunch with me." Izuku gave her a blank look. "It was stolen, but I'll share with you tomorrow," he made the counteroffer. He was pretty sure he could convince Kurogiri to pack extra. Her yellow eyes narrowed. "Good enough. But I want beef. Rare beef," she put in the order. Izuku nodded. "My name's Izuku Kawa," he introduced himself. "Himiko Toga," she gave her own name. "Now follow me," she added, skipping down the corridor. "Thank you," he said as he followed. It wasn't far. Himiko led him to the end of the corridor and out the end door. There was another small corridor and Izuku could see the sign that said, "Teacher's Lounge," at the far end. "Why is it here?" he asked, curiously. "They don't want to deal with us," Himiko shrugged. Dealing with Tomura meant that Izuku knew it wasn't his place to tell Himiko that it was a teacher's job to deal with students. Instead he looked at her. "What class are you in?" he asked. "For tomorrow," he explained. "4C, she said. "I'm in 3A, he told her conversationally as he approached the teacher's lounge. Before he could knock on the door, Izuku heard raised voices. "Why didn't anyone tell me I was getting a disabled student?" The voice complained loudly. It was one Izuku recognized, even though he'd only had half a day of class. "Miss Samae." The voice that replied was masculine but he couldn't hear the words. "Shouldn't be a problem?" Miss Samae shrieked in reply to whatever was said. "It's going to be a huge fucking problem." "You?" Himiko mouthed the question to Izuku. Izuku's eyes were wide. He wanted to shake his head and say no, but he knew she was talking about him. He's fragile. Miss Samae continued. Again the male voice responded, and while they could hear the conciliatory tone, the exact words were too vague to make out. There was a bang from the lounge. It sounded like something hitting a table. I am not dealing with this shit now, Miss Samae yelled, and before Izuku and Himiko could move there came the sound of stomping and the door to the teacher's lounge was thrown open with some force. Miss Samae appeared in the doorway and stepped through before she saw them. Izuku! She shrieked again. Himiko laughed and Izuku thought he heard laughter from within the teacher's lounge as well. Miss Samae, Izuku greeted his teacher. Is there a problem, dear? She asked, her voice too sweet. Suddenly Izuku didn't want to tell her, but he knew he had to say something. My bento has gone missing, he said. He didn't want to accuse anyone of stealing it. Are you sure you had it with you? Miss Samae asked. It would have been a hectic morning for you, coming to a new school. She pressed the explanation onto him. I'm sure it was in my bag, Izuku replied, looking up at her earnestly. Kurogiri would not forget to pack it. Miss Samae said something, but it was too soft to hear. Take a token for the cafeteria, she said, and held out a small plastic chit. But what about the box? Izuku asked. Kurogiri always packed his lunch in the same box. Just get your lunch, she dismissed his concern. It will show up. Himiko laughed again, earning a glare from Miss Samae before the teacher smiled. Be a good senior and show him to the cafeteria, she gave the instruction, before stepping back, through the door and sliding it closed. Himiko laughed again. Oh, wow, what did you do? She asked excitedly as she put one hand on Izuku's shoulder, and turned him around. Nothing. Izuku objected. Must have been something, Himiko told him as they emerged into the classroom corridor again. Izuku sighed. Can you show me to the cafeteria? He asked, feeling down. Yeah, I gotcha, she said, and Izuku followed. It wasn't that far and Izuku discovered that the cafeteria was on the far side of the assembly hall. Classrooms are up top, Himiko told him. You can share my lunch, Izuku offered. It was the least he could do for her, for helping him out. Nah, I don't need it, she replied as Izuku presented the chit and got handed a basic lunch. He sighed as he examined it and then looked around for a place to sit. Most of the tables were crowded, but he spotted a small space and walked over there, Himiko in tow. I thought you had your lunch, newbie. Izuku recognized Zakuro's voice but decided it wasn't worth answering, even if everyone looked at him. Himiko giggled. You should stay away from him, Zakuro continued, this time addressing Himiko. You won't want to get infected, he added. It's not contagious. Izuku objected. What's not? Himiko asked. Quirklessness. Zakuro answered for him. Oh, Himiko said, sounding slightly confused, then Izuku saw something light in her yellow eyes and she nodded. So that's what you did, she laughed. Not contagious, Izuku repeated, looking at Zakuro. He wanted to say something more but didn't want to ruin his chances on the first day. I'll stay, Himiko said. He owes me lunch, she added the explanation. You'll be better if Zakuro muttered something but Izuku didn't hear. Himiko just flipped his classmate the bird and the boy backed off. You don't have to stay, Izuku told her. You'll get your lunch, he added, unable to keep the note of annoyance from his tone. I'm good, Himiko told him, actually meeting his eyes. This is fun, she added. Izuku sighed. It wasn't fun for him. Izuku kept his breath steady as he blew out a small trail of fire. It looked like it was blowing out beads on a string as it alternated as flaring, but still small flames, and tiny, almost non-existent flickering tongues of fire. Very impressive, my little dragon, all for one praised his son. He meant it as well. Izuku's control over Kali Imperium was almost perfect if he could produce those effects with his fire breath. Izuku huffed, pushing the flame away from him before it went out. He looked at his father. I know that if I push air towards the flame I smother it, Izuku said, using the terms his dad had used when describing the effects, and if I pull air away from it, the flames get bigger, he added. But that makes no sense, he commented. What doesn't make any sense? Hisashi asked. Izuku flopped into the chair at the small table set up for them. There was a jug of water and 2 glasses on it. The training room was simple with a combat square marked out and various pieces of equipment around the edge. The table was here so that his dad could watch. Fire is meant to grow with more air, Izuku said, and then when his dad looked slightly confused, he added a further explanation. We learned about atmospheric composition in school this week, he said. And what did you learn? The man feared by the underworld asked his son. Air is composed mostly of nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide and others. All for One nodded. He knew this already. We also learned about fire in our evacuation drills, Izuku continued. Hisashi nodded, keeping the smile from his face. He knew exactly where Izuku was going with this. Fire needs oxygen to burn. That's why we get told to use the fire blankets at school if we can. It cuts off the oxygen in the air to the fire. Izuku blinked up at him. That's why it doesn't make sense that when I use Kali Imperium to push air towards fire breath, it goes out, and when I pull the air away, it gets bigger. The only way it makes sense is if Kali Imperium isn't air control at all but something else. And what do you think it is? All for One asked his son, an unavoidable note of pride in his tone. Kali Imperium isn't air control, it's nitrogen control, Izuku announced. So when I extinguish the fire, I'm pushing nitrogen to it and cutting off the oxygen. And vice versa for when my flame breath gets bigger. Hisashi raised his hands and clapped. Well done, my little dragon. He praised. You already knew. Izuku accused him. Hisashi couldn't help but smile as he nodded. Of course I knew, my little dragon. But it is important for you to be able to analyze your own quirks. Sometimes they aren't exactly what they seem. Izuku accepted that explanation as he nodded. Should I rename it? He asked. That's entirely up to you, Hisashi told him. It honestly didn't matter what Izuku named the quirks he was given since they were all absorbed into his own quirk and that one was still unnamed. His son's face twisted with thought. Kali Imperium means air control. He asked. It does, All for One confirmed before his son dissolved into muttering. He waited a few minutes, listening idly while Izuku debated to himself the merits of altering the name. I don't think it needs to be renamed, Izuku said finally. Since the quirk is nitrogen control and nitrogen makes up about 80% of the air. Calling it air control is still accurate. Hisashi nodded. Very good, my little dragon. Though now that you have figured it out, I think you deserve a new quirk. What would you like? Really? Izuku asked, incredulous. Really, All for One replied. It would be good for Izuku to start taking in more quirks. He was sure Dr. Garaki would like to track their absorption rate as well. And if Izuku got used to taking in more quirks, when he finally asked where they were coming from, that should be an easier conversation. So far, Izuku hadn't shown the need to compulsively take quirks, and that, as far as Hisashi was concerned, was a good thing, but then he did keep Izuku practicing sufficiently that if he did feel compulsion it should be controlled. Izuku dissolved into more mutters and Hisashi laughed. His son was so cute. What? Izuku demanded at the noise. Before you decide, I want to teach you one more thing about your quirk, Hisashi told him. Izuku frowned. All for One could see that Izuku thought he had good knowledge of his quirk. And he did. But he had never been told of one key feature. Give me Kali Imperium. I'll give it back in a few minutes, he instructed. It spoke of Izuku's trust in him that his son's face immediately scrunched up as he felt internally for the quirk. Wah? The little noise of confusion told Hisashi all he needed to know. Green eyes fixed upon him, demanding an explanation. All for One nodded to indicate he knew what was going on. Your quirk is different from mine, he explained. If you keep a quirk long enough. My little dragon, you can't give it away. What? Izuku gasped. It merges with your own quirk, Hisashi continued. So before you take any quirk, you need to consider how it will impact the ones you already have. Izuku nodded slowly, still thinking, and then his head dropped as the muttering began again. All for One heard something about making him lighter to fly better, which was quickly countered by something about fireproofing before Izuku added in debating the merits of getting something completely new. He nodded to himself. Both weight reduction and fireproofing were good options for Izuku to have, and neither were flashy, which meant that they would be far easier to acquire. He could get both and give them to Izuku one at a time. Dr. Garaki could run a search of the quirk registry. I'm not sure, Izuku said finally. I think I'll be able to lift more now that I know Kali Imperium is affecting nitrogen, but being lighter would make it easier to lift myself, but if I can be fireproof. That would mean I could use fire breath far more aggressively without needing to worry about myself. Hisashi nodded. You are keeping the dragon theme, he told his son. Izuku blushed. He probably hadn't thought of that. They are both good options. I will find you something, he told Izuku. Thank you, Daddy. Izuku chirped. Hisashi smiled. It was good to see Izuku so happy. All for One knew that his son wasn't happy at school, but that was the point. He had to learn how cruel people could be. He wouldn't mention school until Izuku brought it up, but Kurogiri kept him well appraised. He'd leave it a while longer before he brought it up with his son. There was no need to push, not when the school was doing it so well. All for One smiled as Izuku went back to practicing. He would have a dragon at his side. One way, or another. Izuku sighed when he looked at his desk. He'd just gotten back from physical education. So long as his classmates didn't use their quirks, he was actually doing well there. His dad had kept his promise and he had begun physical training with Kurogiri. At the moment he just did a lot of running, but it was enough to improve his fitness, and he never trained with Tomura. His class didn't like that, but there was nothing they could do about it. It's probably why they took it out in different ways. He could see that his bag was missing, which meant his lunch was missing. He looked at the chair at his desk. His books were there. They were stacked on the seat. That was something. They were usually there, and no one stole his notebooks, mostly because he took them with him and left them in his locker, the few times he brought them to school. He heaved a breath, trying to remember if he had any lunch tokens in his shoe locker. He thought he did, and if he didn't, well, Himiko usually had some money she'd give him. So long as he got her rare steak the next day. Izuku suspected that it wasn't the steak she liked, but since Kurogiri could usually be convinced to provide something, he didn't feel too bad about asking her. Ugh, Kurogiri. The Misty Man never said anything when he didn't bring home the bento boxes. Instead, he just packed a fresh one the next day. Occasionally he did get the boxes back. They just appeared on his desk. Empty, of course. Usually dirty. He picked up his books and sat at his desk, as the rest of his class filed around him taking their seats. They still had one period to go before lunch. Izuku didn't bother to look at them. After he was blown off by Zakuro, he'd made overtures to them all and was rejected soundly. They all didn't want to be infected. Idiots. Even Miss Samae treated him with kid gloves, but he already knew she thought he had a disability. He didn't. But they didn't know that. No one knew he had a quirk. Quirks. To them, he was quirkless, and Izuku could see the benefits now of his previous school separating the quirkless kids. He'd asked around, but it appeared he was the only quirkless person enrolled. That seemed odd to him, but no one was willing to explain. And he didn't want to ask his dad. He probably knew. It was probably tied into the reason Izuku had to pretend to be quirkless. He knew part of the reason. Dad wanted him to learn what people were truly like, and while his classmates were being mean to him, they were being nice to each other. It was frustrating, but Izuku figured they must have made good friends in the first 2 years. And it wasn't like he was completely alone. Himiko didn't push him away, but she was in the year level above him, so he couldn't spend a lot of time with her. Izuku took notes, diligently copying from the blackboard at the front, when something clattered to the floor and Izuku heard it roll towards his desk. He looked down and felt his eyes widen as he recognized the pencil he lost last week. He bent down, keeping one hand on his notes, and gripping his current pencil. The other one was just out of reach, but Izuku stretched and managed to snag it, pulling himself up to sit back in place before Miss Samae even noticed he'd moved. Of course she hadn't. And even if she had turned, he would have sensed it and pulled himself upright before she saw. All that spatial awareness training with Tomura was coming in handy. PST. The hiss came from behind him. Gimme, the instruction followed. Izuku turned his head and saw Mawari making little gestures at him. He opened his eyes wider to give the girl a look. This was his pencil and she knew it. Quirkless, gimme. The hiss was more intent. Izuku saw the others in the surrounding desks stop writing notes and look at him. He shook his head. He knew the others in his class took his pencils and stuff, but this was the first time he'd gotten one back. Accident or not on Mawari's behalf, he was keeping what was his. Give me the pencil, Deku, she hissed the actual words. He honestly didn't know how Miss Samae didn't hear it. Izuku shook his head again and looked back at his notes. He started copying again after he laid the retrieved pencil under his forearm. "Miss Samae," Mawari called out. Izuku stopped writing and sat up straight with the rest of his class. "Yes, Mawari?" Miss Samae said as she turned from the blackboard. "Izuku took my pencil," Mawari said. For a moment, Miss Samae looked confused. "How did he get your pencil?" she asked. "I dropped it," Mawari explained. "It rolled to him and now he won't give it back." "It's my pencil," Izuku objected. This was the first pencil he'd ever gotten back. He wasn't going to let it go again without saying anything. "I lost it last week." "Izuku, did you pick up the pencil Mawari dropped?" Miss Samae asked. He didn't reply. He had picked it up, but it didn't change the fact that it was his pencil in the first place. "Give Mawari her pencil back," Miss Samae ordered when he remained silent. "It's my pencil." Izuku objected again. "Give Mawari her pencil back," she repeated. There was a snigger from behind him. Mawari, if he wasn't mistaken, but it could have been Kazuba. The two of them were close. Izuku glared. "Detention." Miss Samae snapped. "Give back her pencil," she added. Izuku slowly picked up his pencil and with his eyes still glaring at Miss Samae he waved it in Mawari's general direction. "Now apologize for taking her pencil," Miss Samae added. "And show some respect." "No," Izuku snapped. "Double detention," Miss Samae almost yelled. "And I believe I will put a note on your record." Izuku gaped. "It's my pencil." He objected. "Izuku, I will not hear you accuse your classmates of stealing, so you will stay here at lunch," she told him. There were more sniggers, but this time from the entire class. Izuku didn't say anything. He just bowed his head. There was nothing he could say to those who weren't listening, no matter how unfair it was. No matter how much he wanted to. If he said something more, he didn't know what Miss Samae would do, but he didn't really want to find out. Izuku burned in rage and shame as he sat there. He didn't bother to write any more notes. End chapters 18 and 19. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note: I don't really want to be mean to Izuku, but we know what his dad is expecting, and given what we see of society, I think All for One's expectations will be fulfilled. But hey, Izuku meets Himiko. So it's not all bad. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.